Hi, welcome to Exiting Existence, where we break down complex spiritual topics and try to work out how we can apply them in our everyday life. Because at the end of the day, if you're not acting on what you believe in, then what's the point of saying you believe it? Now, today I want to talk about faith. And we're going to start with looking at one of the most common misconceptions that faith is the absence of knowledge. The reality is that faith is really more like the predecessor to knowledge, or maybe a better way of putting it is faith is the gap between what we know today and what is available to be known. And I'll give you an example. If you think about the Wright brothers when they built the first airplane, at the time, all the knowledge, what was considered to be reasonable, what would be considered to be evidence or the data, all the things that we would normally use to suggest whether a thing is possible or whether a thing is impossible, all said that a human being could not fly. And so the Wright brothers, when they aspired to build the first airplane, at that time were defying everything that knowledge could provide for them. Now, granted, they could have looked at a bird and said, the mechanics of a bird allow it to propel itself off the ground. And so reasonably, we might conclude that if we could construct something similar, that a human being could fly. Of course, there was evidence that flight was at least possible. However, at the time, all knowledge, what was considered reasonable to assume, still suggested that a human being would not be capable of flying. And so when the Wright brothers began the process of building the first airplane, there was a gap between what was known at the time, which is that people don't fly, and eventually discovering that people can fly with the right set of mechanics and the right set of circumstances. There was a void that stood between what was known and what eventually became known. And that void is called faith. Because the truth of the matter is that the Wright brothers would not have gone to the extraordinary lengths that they did. They would have not endured the extraordinary ridicule from their friends and their family and all the people that thought they were completely out of their minds. They would not have been capable of enduring these extraordinary circumstances to pass from what was known at the time to what eventually became known, right? They would not have been capable of enduring such extraordinary circumstances without faith. And you see, so faith was not the absence of knowledge, rather, it was the void between what was known and what was knowable. And so it took extraordinary faith to hold on and make it from here to here. However, there's something really important that they did that many believers, people who say that they believe in God, don't do. You see, it wasn't just that they had the faith. It wasn't just that they walked around and suggested, I believe that it is possible for someone to fly. They didn't go tell all their friends, I believe that we can fly. They didn't go to the local pub and regale their friends with stories of how one day they're going to fly. They didn't just go around and talk about it. No, they took action. And they didn't just take action as if that at some point in time they might fly. They didn't take arbitrary actions that had nothing to do with flight. No, they took very specific actions, actions that worked towards, that put themselves at risk in the moment, today, in the here and now, until the moment that the impossible manifested itself into the earth. Because at the time it was impossible for human beings to fly, and yet by sheer force of will and faith and endurance, they managed to take something that seemed completely impossible, something that was out of reach, something that was unimaginable, and eventually they birthed it right into our natural realm, and it then became a part of our everyday life, even to the extent that now today planes fly over our heads every single day. Now that took faith, but it took more than faith. It took the fortitude to not just say you believe something, but to actually act on it, to do something to prove it out. And see, this is the biggest reason I believe that many believers are not maturing in their faith, because we have all the faith in the world for the eternal, but we have very little faith when it comes time for dealing with things in the natural. You see, we'll go to church and then we'll come home from church excited and we'll tell all our friends how Jesus is going to meet us in heaven. We'll tell people how one day we're going to be whisked off to the pearly gates. We'll discuss how God is so good and how God is going to meet us on the other side. And one day we're going to join him in heaven. But when it comes time to choose a mate, when it comes time to pay a bill, when it comes time to decide what job we're going to have, no, no, no. Instead of acting on faith, instead of saying, God, where should I go? Instead, we say, knowledge, what should we do? When it comes time to choose a mate, we don't go to God and we say, God, which is the right one for me? Direct my path. Move me by your spirit. Use your earth, your spiritual, your powerful wisdom, your outside of time, your capabilities to see beyond what is just right in front of me and tell me who I should marry. No, instead, we look at only what we can see. We begin to look around and we say, wow, that girl, that guy, he's got the right job, he's got the right family, he's got the right set of circumstances. And so we look at only what we can see in the natural, or like a child who plants a seed in the ground and we cover it up hoping that it might grow into something. And after 5 minutes, when nothing's happened, we go and dig that seed back up and still nothing has happened. We cover it back up and we come back and we check it over and over and over again until that seed finally starts to sprout, right? And now we have a little bit more knowledge. We've seen that something's happening, and it's just enough to let us have the patience to wait until it actually breaks ground. And then eventually that thing grows and grows and grows, and eventually it starts to bear fruit, and we start to see what kind of tree it is. And so we've kind of watched this process, and previously it was faith. We didn't know what was going to happen, but now we've seen it with our own eyes. We see the kind of fruit that the tree is going to bear. And so in the same way, we like to use that knowledge. We want to see it first, right? We want to know before we act. And so when we look for a mate, we don't look for the seed in the ground. No, instead, we look for the tree that's full grown, that has the fruit already on it. We know exactly what it's going to be. It's got the right family, the right pedigree, the right career, the right looks. It's everything that we want it to be today. And so instead of relying on God, we rely on knowledge and we choose that mate. But you see, when we go to God, God says, hey, look, I know it doesn't quite have the right looks at the moment. It doesn't have the right family or the right career yet, but what you don't realize is that seed is still in the ground. You see, you don't know what it's going to grow up into yet. But if you just have a little bit of faith, if you'll just have a little bit of trust, then you might see something powerful. You might see a miracle. You might see that seed grow up and one day become a mighty tree that bears fruit for many, many generations. But you got to have a little bit of faith. And it's not just enough to have a little bit of faith. You have to act on that faith. But you see, most of us, we see the tree the fruit's already on it. We don't have to have any faith for that. We know, we can see it with our own eyes. We do the same thing with jobs. When it comes time to choose a job, we don't ask the almighty, immortal, immovable, all-knowing God what we should do for work. Where will we be most satisfied? How can we be most productive? What will be the best place for us for our future? No, instead we say, what's the biggest paycheck? Is it in the right city? Does it have the right health benefits? And so we go to knowledge again, and we tap the reservoir of knowledge and we say, what can be known? And so we make our decisions based on what can be known. You see, God says, if you just would have trusted me, I would have taken you to this startup. And that startup, even though that seed is still in the ground, you didn't know what it was going to be yet. See, if you had just trusted me, that startup would have grown up one day and become a mighty company. And because you were there so early, you would have gotten some shares. And those shares one day would have been worth millions of dollars and would have blessed your family for generations and generations and generations. But you were so ready to have faith in me for the eternal. But you couldn't even believe me for the natural. You see, guys, it's easy to have faith for something that costs us nothing. We're all going to die. We're all going to come to an end. It's easy to believe that there's a loving, caring, compassionate God waiting on the other side of that tunnel, because we're all headed towards that end. There's nothing we can do to stop that. You see, what's not easy is to trust that loving, compassionate God actually has our best interest today. You see, it's not easy to trust him today. It's not easy to trust him and live by faith in spite of what we know. It's not easy to believe that God is directing our path when everything that we know says otherwise. It's not easy to build the plane when no one has ever flown. See, that's the difference between faith and knowledge. Faith is not the absence of knowledge. It is the predecessor to knowledge. Faith is the gap between what you know today and what is available to be known. But the question is, will you trust God long enough to learn something new? See, most of us are living our lives by knowledge. We say that we live by faith, but we act like we live by knowledge. And that is the greatest travesty in the life of a believer. The greatest travesty in the life of a believer is sacrificing the infinite for the finite. When if we would just trust God, we could begin to birth the infinite into the finite. Just like the Wright brothers brought flight from the sky to the ground and made it part of everyday life. Imagine what would happen if we would trust God long enough to bring the eternal into the mortal. Imagine if we would trust him long enough to let the supernatural break out into the natural. Can you imagine the things that we would see? The incredible thing is we don't have to. If you go back to the scriptures and you look at the mighty men of faith, men who didn't just say they believed in God, but they acted like they believed in God. Those were the Moseses of the world who got to see the living God in the natural world. Those are the Elijahs who saw fire come down from heaven, the Daniels who saw the end of the world, men who saw angels. How much are we missing out on as believers because we are so content to live by what we can know today that we are unwilling to sacrifice just a little bit to discover something, to know something that is beyond what we can see. And this is the purpose of faith. And the irony is that sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes people that don't even believe in God have more capacity to act in faith than those of us who have the very Holy Spirit who confirms his presence and existence. And that is sad. And the truth is, I'm guilty. This is not an admonition to any of you who are watching this. I'm as guilty as anybody else. There are plenty of days where I live far below the capacity that we are built for. And so if you're watching this, I want to encourage you to take stock of your life. It doesn't mean you need to quit your job and, go do something crazy. It doesn't mean you need to, drop your girlfriend and go be with somebody else. It doesn't mean you need to, not consider wisdom. This is not the point. The point that I'm making here is that you need to take a moment and ask yourself, are you living by knowledge first and then asking God what he thinks? Or are you living by God first and giving it enough time so that you can know what he thinks? I think that's the question that we all need to ask ourselves, because I can only imagine a world where all of the believers begin to act as though they believed to the level that they say that they believe.